Imagine stepping into the world where the boundaries of game development are not just dictated by the creators, but by you, the player. Oh shit, that already fucking exists. Welcome to the world of early access, where developers invite gamers to experience, explore, and possibly shape their unfinished products. For a marginal fee, of course. Remember, it's not about playing, it's about participating. What began as a practical solution to support indie developers and fuel community-driven creativity has transformed into quite a powerful trend in gaming that offers both risks and rewards to the developers and players alike. So this model has grown from the humble days of beta testing and exploded in 2013 with Steam's launch of its early access program. All of a sudden, developers had a direct path to funding and real-time feedback, while players were given the chance to influence the game's final design. Honestly, I have a sore spot when it comes to early access, and most people's opinions are obviously largely based on their own personal experiences with this business model, whether they're positive or negative. When you really start to look at the data and peel back this putrid, stinky fucking onion, it starts to potentially expose early access as more of a deterrence both for the developer and the player alike. Now, it's easier and kinder and simpler just to say, as a whole, that early access has had a tremendous positive influence on the gaming industries, and it's easy to say that because we're largely looking at the most successful titles. When you hear early access, you hear about Subnautica or Conan Exiles, Ark Survival, Minecraft, right? Baldur's Gate 3, Path of Exile 2, you hear about successes. But when you really start to look under the fucking sheets, when you start to look into the skeletons of the closet, and when you peel back this fucking putrid smell, you start to really identify that these examples are actually outliers. You start to uncover that it actually is doing more harm than good. I mean, frankly, have you heard of Towns, Bot Colony, Earth's Year 2066, Space-Based DF9, or The Stomping Land? Maybe. Well, they're not games anymore, and they never will be. And similar to communism, I think early access, again, as a whole, is much better written on paper than practiced in real life. Whoa, girl, easy there. Before you start trashing me in the comments, I obviously understand that when early access is executed well, it is a wonderful, wonderful experience for both the developer and the player. But more often than not, I'm telling you, it leads to more problems than it does rewards. So let's first look at the feel-good, positive effects that early access provides to developers and the players when everything is being perfectly executed and everything is being fired on all cylinders. So for the developer, of course, the number one thing is funding and cash flow, right? Early access allows developers to generate funds to continue working on the game, especially for indie studios where those resources are limited. It could certainly help kind of push development over that edge in order to be released. Of course, developers can also receive real-time feedback from players. This can certainly help with identifying bugs and balance issues and even features that players may like or dislike, and then make changes based off that feedback. So this allows developers to just continually make refinements and improvements on the actual end-user experience. Not only that, but early access can foster a community. Aw, isn't that cute, right? A loving, dedicated fan base that become game advocates, that spread the word and report issues and create content. Better yet, by releasing the game early, developers can stress test servers, gameplay mechanics, and features, and it provides insights into how the game performs under real-world conditions, leading to far better optimization. And of course, the number one priority, driving sales and marketing, right? Early access can help to create that buzz and really build the anticipation for the full release, and when done successfully, can honestly double a company's revenue from what they earned in early access. Now pivoting to the players, they get to experience the game before it's fully finished. It offers them a unique opportunity to evolve it over time and participate in its change and its design. And honestly, some players, if they're passionate about the developer or overall the vision of the game, they love to be the first adopter, right? Getting it in on the ground floor of the game when it just started. Now, one of the major benefits to the player, of course, and to the developer is that they can influence development. The player can participate and often feel like they have a voice with the game development. And when you're talking about working alongside your favorite game series or your favorite developer, right, it could inspire a really good, cozy feeling. Now, of course, to further incentivize players, they'll get some exclusive content, right? They'll offer players exclusive bonuses or skins or in-game items just to thank them for their support during development. But what they're really thanking you for is your money. Probably one of the best benefits for the player is that they can support indie developers, right? Helping bring innovation to maybe niche games that might otherwise struggle to get funding. And lastly, right, many early access titles are sold at a discounted price compared to their full release, so players can sometimes get the game for less than it will cost later on. Now, these examples are becoming less and far in between, but nevertheless, right, this is a way for developers to offer a trade-off to play a game that's a work in progress. So overall, right, for both the developer and gamer, it offers longer-term engagement as users return to the game to see new features and updates and improvements, and this can lead to a dedicated, loyal player base that sticks to the game as it evolves. And of course, the collaboration between the developers and players help to create a more polished and well-received final product, right? Developers can prioritize and change based on the needs of the player, and that possibly may make the final version more aligned with player experiences. So there you go. That is the positive benefits of early access when it literally is firing on all cylinders, and you know what I mean, when everything is working according to plan. To be part of that, I think, is great. To give businesses funding, especially indie developers that don't have that money, and to actually make a meaningful change in that game plays or the game's development, it's good. I mean, it is really a brilliant business model. That being said, I mean, let's just look at the facts. I mean, let's just look at the data. Because data is void from personal experiences and fucking bias. And this data is based on artificial intelligence, so, right, take it with a grain of salt. But as of February 2025, there is approximately 9,024 games listed under the early access category on Steam. That's a lot of fucking games. And on average, a game spends 2.5 years in early access. Now, what's even shocking is that, and this is data based on 2024, is that it was reported that only 25% of early access titles have been released as full games, indicating that 75% still remained unfinished. And this ratio of 75-25 has been there since early access's inception. And in fact, in 2016, 90% of games were left unfinished or still in early access period. So let's get dark. Let's get dirty, and let's talk about some of the negative impacts that early access has had for both the developer and the player. Now, for developers, they potentially can have a negative public perception based on the fact that the game is unfinished or buggy. Isn't that the whole fucking point, though? Is to have a buggy, unfinished game? Isn't that what early access is for? So inherently, by giving a game that's buggy and unfinished, which is what early access is supposed to do, right? Players can encounter these issues like crashes and unfinished features or bugs that can harm the game's overall reputation. And because Steam tracks reviews right from an early access and then keeps that all the way to launch, right? You can see how it can have a detrimental effect to when the game eventually launches. Overall, too, players' expectations versus reality, right? Some players may expect a more polished experience and then become frustrated, right, if the game doesn't meet their expectations. And that can lead to, again, bad publicity or players just abandoning the game altogether. Oh, and let's not forget players' expectations. because nothing's more important than hearing feedback from someone who's never developed a game in their fucking lives. So players' expectations can be negative, right? Because they might assume that the game will be finished faster or that it should have more content than the developers can actually realistically deliver. And when the developers have this community and they're hearing all the fucking feedback and changes that they want, that can create literally more work than actual benefits or impact, right? Because now the developers are spending all the time going through, you know, Johnny's wish list of wanting a pink backpack, you know what I mean? So that can lead to a lot of pressure to developers, right? And that can lead them to maybe rush things or actually deprioritizing and focusing on the feedback rather than important quality checks in order just to meet players, again, demands. Now developers can face also unpredictable funding, right? Depending on early access sales, it can be risky. If the game doesn't get enough attention or it fails to meet players' expectations, again, it might not generate the revenue needed to continue development, leaving the project in just complete fucking limbo. Also, developers can experience burnout, right? They can experience burnout from ongoing development and the constant cycle of updates and patches required for early access games, right? They're constantly there trying to satisfy player feedback, and that can be fucking exhausting, you know, especially when the game isn't fully finished. Now, some negative experiences for the player. Early access can often involve a work in progress. Well, who would have thought? So that means that there could be a lack of essential features or storylines or content. And so players might feel frustrated, right? Because they invested the money and their time in a game that is inherently missing some key components and just offers an incomplete experience. So that's what I mean by this is like a fucking double-edged sword. On one hand, players should expect an unfinished or buggy game, and on the other hand, that could drive the game to its demise. It's fucking ridiculous. So you have to kind of wonder, early access is mostly successful when 80% of the game is actually finished, which in turn just goes to show you that, well, developers really don't care about your fucking opinion. I mean, let's real. You're not really going to change the big brain conceptual design of a game. You're there for quality assurance, right? Tests and bugs and balance changes, right? It is a way for developers to simply outsource that activity to you, right? Why pay someone internally to do it when these fuckers can buy the game and do it for us? Honestly, I know I'm being really one-sided with these arguments, but you have to understand the irony with what early access offers, right, when everything goes well, and then the other spectrum of when everything goes to shit. You really don't want to release that game too early. You know what I mean? Because, you know, you have a bad perception on early access, that's going to follow you to launch. Right? And my God, I can't imagine just listening to all the petty fucking feedback on balance changes and all this stuff, you know what I mean? And just trying to, you know, but the customer's always right. Well, not when it leads to, you know, burnout or games not even being finished in the first place and people's passion projects going to shit. So of course, another negative for players that you need to know before going into this is that you can encounter game-breaking bugs, crashes, and technical problems, and that can make the experience unpleasant. These issues can sometimes take time to fix. It can be frustrating, especially for players who are paying to play something that isn't fully functional. And really, the price tag here, I think, is a key component. Of course, the risk to the player is that developers can release patches and updates at a very slow pace, or not at all. Fuck it. Gotcha, bitch. You know, and that can leave players stuck with the same issues or content for very, very long periods. This can make it hard for players to stay engaged or excited about the game as it evolves. A risk, of course, is that based on all the wonderful feedback, right, some features or mechanics that some players enjoy in early access might actually be altered or removed entirely in the final version, right? And this can be disappointing if there's a player that invested time in something that they thought would remain in the game. And again, based on the data I talked about, there is an uncertainty. Not all early access games make it to full release, right? Some may be abandoned before completion, due to funding problems or lack of player interest or other unforeseen issues. So players may feel they've invested that time and money into a game that's actually never really reached its fully potential. Shit, that kind of reminds me like myself. And lastly, the lack of refunds. Fuck you if the game doesn't get released. You don't get your money back. You know why? Because you played it for more than 2 hours. So, of course, Steam has some very, very stringent refund policies. So you may not get your money back. You may not get that refund, even if the player is unhappy with the current state of the early access, right? And that can feel obviously unfair. So overall, the risk here is that there's misaligned expectations, right? That there's a disconnect between what the player expects from an early access title, right? A polished, near-finished product, and what developers can realistically deliver, which is a game that's still being actively worked on, and that can create maybe tension and dissatisfaction. So it's a fucking balancing act. One of my biggest negative comments, and this just probably applies to me, but have you ever tried to actively give constructive criticism to an early access title that has a very loyal niche fan base and try to actually communicate and have a constructive conversation? Some early access games and their communities, not all, and I'm not going to mention any specific names, are very toxic. And if you mention 1 ounce of constructive criticism, which by the way is the fucking point of an early access title, you know what? I'll tell you what. You know what? Fucking they say? You know what their excuse is? Well, it's early access, bro. That content's gonna come later, right? So, God forbid you can actually give feedback about a game in EA, which is the whole fucking point, without some fucking loyal fan base community twat giving you the whole excuse of, well, it's early access. As if that alone justifies shit. As if that's like a fucking bulletproof vest where it doesn't matter how fucking warranted, or it doesn't matter how right you are with that change or what you may find bad about that game. It's early access, bro. How dare you provide feedback to an early access title? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's just me. But I swear to God, that's my pet peeve. I swear to God, if I have to hear that fucking excuse, it's early access, bro, as if there's some fucking future crystal ball that they have that I don't, I'm gonna lose it. I'm gonna lose it! Do you understand how counterintuitive it is to give feedback only to have a community or certain gamers to say, well, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if the game is shit because it's early access. You know what I mean? Like, I swear to God, you could offer them shit on a fucking stick and they'll be so fucking just blinded by their love for a certain developer or a certain game, and they want it to succeed. They just believe it. It's in their believies that they're just clouded in their judgment. The other issue, based on the data I suggested, how the fuck do you even have time for all these early access titles, right? Because the barriers of entry are so low and everyone is marketing their game and providing a sort of demo, it completely floods the market with a ton of games. And what this does is saturate the market to the point where you could actually overlook a really good game just because you couldn't find it or that they didn't market it properly, and thereby making early access irrelevant for the developer because they don't have the community, they don't have the feedback, they don't have the players' money, they don't have access to funding. And even if you do have a good experience playing an early access title, right? Once launch hits, all your data is erased, your save file is gone. So you're basically starting from scratch. And if you're extremely busy and you don't have the time, and I'm not talking about hardcore die fans, right, that, like, for an example, are into Path of Exile 2, and of course, that resets every season, so early access model really fits well. But for other games, that may not be, something you want to dive into. And even if you do play a game that you really enjoy during early access, right, constant patches. Like, for example, Baldur's Gate 3, that took years in early access, and they constantly wiped their servers and you had to start from scratch. So even though the game is remarkable, that could certainly deter you from continuing and wanting to play. So then the issue is then you just abandon the game so that you can carry that excitement for launch. I mean, how many early access titles I've stopped playing because I wanted to wait for launch in order to feel the full game. I could have just waited for the full game at that point. Not to mention, unless there is massive changes to a game from early access to launch, you feel like you've already kind of experienced it already. So it makes the launch almost irrelevant in certain scenarios. Because in order for an EA to do really well, it pretty much has to be 80% complete. So really, is that 20% of improvement really justifies paying for an early access title? So if the game is already 80% finished, then what you're essentially paying for in early access is for the remaining 20%. And that largely involves, again, just tactical quality assurance, monitoring bugs and doing balance changes at the end of the day, which then disqualifies the whole, hey, I actually can make an impact on this game and they will listen to my they will listen to my feedback because the game is already written. It's already done. Is almost irrelevant, I find. And it's certainly most irrelevant because most games are live service anyway. So this process of gathering feedback and listening to players and making those changes, that's an iterative process that still exists in games after launch, right? There's patches after launch. So you're paying for an early patch only to get another patch shortly after launch anyway, and then throughout the game's life cycle. So at the end of the day, what the model essentially suggests is that developers will reduce their risk of a bad early access launch by essentially providing a polished game that's about 80% there. Because why would a developer release something that's 25 or 50% done only to get fucked over by the negative impressions and public perception on the early access launch, right? So in order to reduce their risks, developers are just going to polish their games and have us be the grunts doing the testing. It's fucking genius when you look at it. I know that this business model isn't going anywhere, and I can certainly appreciate what it does, especially for smaller developers, but it just ain't for me. And I know what some of you guys are thinking. Well, Jack, if you don't like the business model, well, you don't have to buy into it. Well, then that fucking defeats the point of its existence in the first place. I think a couple solutions Steam can do to really help this business model is, number one, hide the review metrics. When I'm talking about review metrics, I'm talking about the overall thumbs up and thumbs down that players give, as well as the overall tallied score, whether it's mixed reviews, overwhelmingly negative, or positive. If you hide that, then all it is a database of players providing their own feedback, and it won't necessarily deter new players from coming in, especially if a game, right, is rough around the edges and it does have a really bad early access launch. It essentially won't be pre-writing a game's destiny. So eliminating the need to see those metrics could hide the fact and make things a little bit more collaborative, so to speak, which is the whole, essence of what EA is trying to do. Nor would it maybe impede players from even trying the game in the first place, because with funding, games do get better. And there are scenarios where developers drastically need that funding, again, for smaller indie type studios, where they make big differences with the money that they've incurred. So this reduces the risk for the developer because they're not recognized for what they did in early access at launch, but they're recognized for all the changes they've made for the full release. I think another really good thing Steam could do is actually reduce the discount off the early access title. So you buy the game at 50%, that's the trial period, and at full release, you have the opportunity to spend 50% more to get the full launch, or otherwise, you get the refund. I think that would certainly help players to experience more of these games, especially when there's so many of them, right? It's a risk and reward, and right now, it's too risky. It's too risky for players to plunge into something new based on just some marketing material. Or what they can do is simply add a donation type process. So people can donate, right, $5 or $10 in order to experience the game. And if they're not interested at launch, right, they can either offer the refund or they can pay the difference in order to access the full launch. So these are just but some examples of how maybe you could reduce the risk both on the developer and the player. But at the end of the day, with so many video games out there and so many titles in early access, it's become convoluted, and there's just too much risk for me personally as a gamer when I already don't have fucking time for shit, and I have 50 fucking games sitting there on my backlog, you know, that I've been waiting to play but I haven't had the time. So with me not even having the time to play these backlog games that I've purchased fully, how am I going to actually then justify spending money on an early access, a demo, just taking the face value of the developer? I don't know. I personally, I don't feel early access is in a good place right now. I'm very curious what you guys think. What are your thoughts and comments? Did you have a positive experience with early access in general? Or did you have a lot of negative experiences? I would love to know. Anyway, jack-offs, I'll catch you on the next one.